Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the news briefing this Wednesday, April 1st. The county recently completed a study on an area of our county that has experienced increasing flood impacts over many years. It's a very complicated issue. Here to go over the Bolsa Knolls drainage study and some of its findings is Randy Ishii. He's our Director of Public Works, Facilities and Parks. And also, after going over the study, he's going to give us an update on Measure AA and some of the projects. Hi, Randy. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon, Maya and everyone, and thank you very much for the generous invitation, Maya, to be able to present today and speak today to our public. So the first item, as Maya mentioned, is an update that the County Public Works, Facilities and Park staff presented to the County Board of Supervisors regarding a drainage study of what is known as the Santa Rita Creek, also known as Little Bear Creek, that flows through the community of Bolsa Knolls. I'm going to go over a PowerPoint presentation that we presented to the Board of Supervisors at their 24 March 26 Board of Supervisors meeting. In the interest of time, we'll probably condense and compress it down some. So I'm going to share my screen. There will be a brief pause as we do so. Here we are. So again, this is presented to the full Board of Supervisors on 24 March 26. And the presentation's overview first start off with talking about the background information about the entire Santa Rita Creek watershed, as well as flooding history, and then the drainage study that the County Board of Supervisors commissioned this past year. We'll then talk about the existing conditions as shown and demonstrated by the hydrologic and hydraulic model and the channel capacity that we now know based on this information. We'll talk about the consultant's recommendations, and then we'll end with talking about the County Board of Supervisors' direction to staff on next steps. So as shown on the first slide, this is the entire watershed for the Little Bear Creek, also known as Santa Rita Creek, that goes to the community of Bolsa Knolls. This is an aerial photo image, and the portion of land that is circled with the red colored ovular shape is the unincorporated community of Bolsa Knolls, which resides immediately north of the city of Salinas. The colored area that you see that has the thick boundary delineated around it represents the watershed, or said a different way, any single drop of water that falls from the sky in the form of precipitation that hits anywhere in that colored area within those boundaries of that thick black colored border will make its way into that blue line shown on the screen of the Santa Rita Creek, aka Little Bear Creek, that'll flow southerly into the community of Bolsa Knolls, and then westerly through the city of Salinas, ultimately out to where it will terminate and eventually find its way out to the ocean. So again, by way of background, the county established a floodplain management plan back in 2002. And took the years prior to adopt this floodplain management plan. And in that plan, they identified various repetitive loss properties within the community of Bolsa Knolls. Generally speaking, these are single-family dwellings in the area that are pre-flood insurance map structures. The flood insurance program did not take place until approximately 1984. So again, these homes were built long before the National Flood Insurance Program was established. And generally, these are areas where the lowest floor elevations are below that 100-year floodplain elevation. So the floodplain management plan identifies the primary solution for the Bolsa Knolls repetitive loss properties to elevate the structures. And generally speaking, there is greater than 60 plus properties that are within this repetitive loss property area. These pictures on this screen help demonstrate the history of flooding in the community of Bolsa Knolls. And as we see, there was flooding in 2025, flooding in 2022, flooding in 2017, and even further back than the first picture in the upper left-hand corner denoting 2014. So lots of history of flooding in this community of Bolsa Knolls. And as mentioned, the County Board of Supervisors commissioned both funding and for Public Works, Facilities and Park staff to engage with a consultant on a drainage study, also known as a flood study. And the objective of that study was to develop and evaluate a set of feasible project alternatives to reduce the flood risk in Bolsa Knolls. One of the first steps was to get an understanding of these hydrologic and hydraulic conditions in that Little Bear Creek / Santa Rita Creek. It's not known what the flow carrying capacity was of that Santa Rita Creek until we studied it. So the first thing the consultants did was they took the existing site conditions and performed their study. These graphs that you see on the screen are called hydrographs. And what they do is they show the amount of flow versus the amount of time for any given storm event that is modeled, and shows the amount of flow coming down the creek based on the time at which that storm started and to when it ends. So you'll see what's called a bell curve. And that means that the water's coming down the creek, and as time goes on and as the storm is continuing to drop rain from the sky, that rain is making its way into the creek, and now the flow in that creek is beginning to increase and increase and increase as the storm continues on. And then as the storm ends, the flow will also commensurately reduce in that creek. So the takeaway from this is that the greater the storm event, the more flow that comes down the creek. And what we have learned is that the creek has a carrying capacity of 100 cubic feet per second. Said a different way, if you imagine 100 basketballs coming down per second down the creek, that roughly represents the amount of flow that the creek is able to carry before it starts to overtop and start flooding. So again, the Santa Rita Creek, just upstream from Rogie Road, currently overtops its banks at a flow rate of around 100 cubic feet per second, or 100 basketballs coming down per second. And this is one of the models that are shown by our consultants, who are very familiar with and well versed in this topic, are able to represent through their computer model, showing the amount of flooding that occurs, in this case, during a 10-year return flood event. So the consultant considered different recommendations, which generally took the span of 4 different project types. One is to increase the size of the culverts. Another is to remove the sediment as needed at the culvert crossings. Another is to do selective vegetation management within key channel segments. And then the larger project was the construction upstream of the community of Bolsa Knolls for sediment retention and stormwater detention basins. So in the interest of time, we'll just briefly go over the information on these next set of slides. So generally speaking, culvert upsizing is something that requires permits to be acquired from the various state and federal resource agencies. By that, I mean the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Regional Water Quality Control Board, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and some others. And that's activity that the staff at Public Works are familiar with the process of acquiring permits. And so generally speaking, a preliminary planning level cost estimate for this type of work ranges from $500,000 to $1 million. These are the culverts in particular, showing the existing condition and what is proposed. Again, another example, this time at Rogie Road. And the second project, as mentioned, was remove sediment at these culvert crossings. And this is an ongoing activity that the department always does. As we've talked about in past media briefings, or as our county communication staff have conveyed to the public and to the media, this is that ongoing activity that the department does before the rainy season, where we clean out the sediment that comes from the upstream private properties and causes some reductions in flow in our culverts. This is the type of work that we do in generally the fall season, and it takes us anywhere from approximately $35,000 to $40,000 per cleaning. And this is some examples of that same sediment that we referred to. Then thirdly, there's been much talk about the concept of removing vegetation along the Santa Rita Creek. This is something that does require interaction with the permitting authorities. Any kind of extensive vegetation management where permits are required would be very challenging. And these regulators ultimately dictate the extent and type of vegetation that can be thinned or removed. That's all part of the requirements and mitigations of which these outside parties would subscribe back to someone who wants to do work in the creek. A concept that our consultant also conveyed was the idea of doing very selective vegetation management where permits would likely not be required. And generally that'd be relatively straightforward type of work, ranging from $50,000 to $150,000. Again, a preliminary planning level cost estimate. And the slide denotes those areas that they highlighted where selective vegetation management could occur, and there would be some interaction with the permitting entities if that work would be done. So the fourth level project was sediment retention and stormwater detention basins. And the concept is for the county to acquire land somewhere upstream in the community of Bolsa Knolls where enough land could be acquired and that land could then be graded, i.e. using excavators and bulldozers to dig it out and create these basins that would serve the purposes of first capturing sediment that comes down the creek from further upstream properties. Secondly, to lower the peak flow rates. And then thirdly, to reduce the summer, what are called nuisance flows entering the steady reach that promote vegetative growth. And these basins have the potential to significantly reduce flooding realized during these storm events, as has been modeled. And it could reduce the amount of structures that are affected in the steady reach from 43 down to 4. In this case, during the December 2022 storm event that was modeled. So next steps with this would involve site selection and review of property acquisition options, as well as environmental review, also known as the California Environmental Quality Act at the state level, and the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, at the federal level, and permitting would be required for this type of work. And these are some examples based on the extent of these different options of how large these basins would need to be, but not necessarily the location that is ultimately selected. Again, these are conceptual. The land would still have to be sited, acquired, and there would be one basin or multiple basins that serve this volume or capacity that are needed. So our consultant took those different projects and put them into different alternatives. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go over all the details as shown on the screen, but for the benefit of the public, this is all part of the information conveyed at the March 24th Board of Supervisors meeting. There was a fifth alternative that the department was asked to look into, and that was to completely clear out the creek of both sediment and vegetation and restore it to the way it was when the Federal Emergency Management Agency first did their initial flood insurance study, or said a different way, when they did the study, the last study known on record in the late 1970s for the creek and how it existed back in the 1970s. And what the consultant found from their modeling effort is that this alternative 5 of completely clearing out the creek does not offer clear advantages over the other evaluated alternatives when considering effectiveness, constructability, and long-term performance. And these flood control benefits associated with this alternative are generally comparable to the alternatives that were shown in the previous slide, where some work is done in the creek, such as upsizing the culverts and clearing out the sediment in the culverts, as well as that selective vegetation management. And so this alternative is not any better than those other alternatives. And the challenges with this alternative, particularly the permitting, will be greater than these other alternatives. As mentioned before, there's environmental review that the county has to conduct, just like any private developer would have to do. And so there's both state level CEQA study and compliance that needs to be done, as well as federal NEPA compliance that needs to be done. There's also the complication of the permits, where there's various state and federal level permits that are required. So in considering all of what's needed just at the permitting level, our estimate is that it would take approximately $2 million just to acquire the permits and the environmental clearances to even consider doing this creek clearing work. Now, that's just the permitting. The constructability is a different challenge. So what's seen is that when the creek goes through the residential area of Bolsa Knolls, one finds that the creek becomes very narrow and there's lots of private property improvements that have been built all the way up to and sometimes in the creek itself. That makes a very difficult construction challenge for a construction crew after these permits are acquired, if that is the direction ultimately selected. So the challenges of working around all these private improvements, much less getting access into these backyard areas, become a very difficult construction challenge for any construction contractor. And so the preliminary planning level cost estimate to do this creek clearing work after the permits are acquired are anywhere from $1 million to $4 million. So when you add together the environmental review, the permitting, and then the construction costs themselves, this is anywhere from a couple $1 million to at least $6 million for doing this creek clearing work. And what's more is that because the entire watershed and because the storm events happen every year and it's difficult to determine how much sediment will come off the upstream private properties in any given year, this work would have to be done periodically. So it's not a matter of doing it once. It would have to continue to be done at some given time period thereafter the first initial cleaning. So to summarize all those different options together, our consultant paired all the information together and shows in this table how many structures are reduced in the amount of flooding that occurred during a given storm event, and the very approximate preliminary planning level costs associated with each of these alternatives. So taking it from the one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum, under the existing conditions during the 100-year flood event, approximately 81 structures are flooded or impacted by that storm event. And then if we were to take it down to alternative 4, where we have a 100-year flood event, there would still be 70 structures that are impacted by the flood events. And then again, the costs are shown at the bottom row of this table. And what one will take away is that with the alternatives that require the acquisition of land and then grading work, those costs are not quite known yet because county staff have not been directed to engage with a real estate agent to look at buying properties, and these properties upstream are have a given land value at market rate that are quite sizable in costs. And then there's that construction work that's needed after that land is acquired. And county staff also brought this to the other partner agencies that do work in creeks or have an interest in water resources. And that includes the Salinas Valley Basin Water Sustainability Agency and the Resource Conservation District of Monterey County. And when we showed this draft version and just shared summaries of information to these groups, when they saw the summaries, both groups were generally supportive of these project alternatives, and they offered insight into the challenges from their own experience with these regulatory agencies. So other options that staff brought for the board's consideration were to consider code enforcement actions against upstream private property owners who are not properly controlling the erosion from their properties. And another alternative that the board considered was the creation of another special district or joint powers authority that serves the purposes of maintaining the creek. So of those special district options, there were various ones that staff had brought to the board's attention. These are inclusives, but they are not limited to these various options. So again, in the interest of time, we'll just go through these briefly, that there was reclamation districts and levee districts that were brought to the board. There were protection districts, 2 different kinds for different years. There was also the idea of a flood control and water conservation district. And then if those options were not suitable for one reason or another, there's also the idea of creating a public agency through special legislation in particular at the state level. So state level legislation would have to be passed to create these other types of special districts. And in general, the Monterey County Local Agency Formation Commission, also known as LAFCO, have a process when it comes to creation of these new special districts or public agencies. So LAFCO would have a process involved and would need interaction with and approval with these different options. But another idea that was brought forward was the idea of a joint powers authority, which is a somewhat more streamlined approach that occurs through agreements between different public agencies. So since the county is not the flood control entity, this creation of a new entity that exists specifically for flood control and creek maintenance through the community of Bolsa Knolls is one that is a possibility that could exist and could clear the sediment from the Santa Rita Creek as needed and could strive for these long-term project alternatives that were shown several slides prior. So staff brought these different recommendations to the board for their consideration at the March 24th, 2026 board meeting. The board considered these various options, and after a very robust discussion, what the board did was they took all this consideration. They received the presentation of what and the report, aka the flood study of which staff had brought forward. And what they directed staff to do was they directed staff to come back in 60 days, that's 60 days from the board meeting, and come back with a more detailed plan with these refined options. The board had some questions about it, as well as what could these real estate costs even be in terms of this market. And so in 60 days, they asked the staff to come back with clearer costs and project details of those alternatives that were shown. They also wanted to know what is the sediment removal costs, including the possibility of a major cleanup. They want to know better about the culvert upgrades. They want to know more about what ongoing maintenance needs would be, as well as retention basin costs for acquisition, construction, and then maintenance. They also wanted more information on governance and funding structures that were shown, i.e. those special districts, and evaluate how that work will be managed and paid for. And that would also include what is involved with expanding or modifying existing county service areas. They want to know what's all involved with creating a new special district. They want more information on how to form a joint powers authority, if that's a possibility. And then to compare the costs and the efficiencies of each of these options. Those are the longer term alternatives on the docket, which they would like staff to come back with additional information on. And also in those 60 days, they asked that staff consider any immediate actions that can be done. In particular, selective vegetation removal that could possibly be done if permits are not required. So those are all things of which staff have been asked to bring back in 60 days time. So Public Works, Facilities and Parks staff have taken that direction from the board and are doing their research on it. And as best as possible, we'll be providing an update 60 days from the March 26 board meeting. And so that concludes what we have available at this point in time. This was a very significant amount of work that both our consultants and our staff needed to do, since this is not something that we do. We do roads and bridges and county building maintenance and park maintenance. So doing a flood study was significantly beyond anything that Public Works staff do. So a big thank you to the Public Works staff for making this possible. And ma'am, I'm available for questions on that, or I can go on to our next topic on the agenda.
Yeah, before we go on to measure AA, I did get a couple questions about the study, and it sounds, and the questions really are about the challenges that were created by the study, because this is information we wanted to know because we were looking for solutions, but what we found were, and maybe we expected to find, were that the solutions were also very challenging, that it's more than just the county being able to solve the problem at hand. And I was wondering if you might just talk a little bit about how there are many parts to this and many people who would be, or many entities which may be part of a long-term solution?
That's an excellent question, Maya, and it gets more involved, and there is more detail of what this staff member is able to summarize from our flood study. So the public's welcome to look at our flood study for more detail about what we're about to convey. But there's a significant challenge in terms of the entire flood situation itself in the community of Bolsa Knolls, as well as the upstream properties, because this is a multi-jurisdiction issue. There's not one single entity that is responsible for creek maintenance, much less flood prevention in that entire community or along the entire Santa Rita Creek. There's a map that helps convey in much better detail of what I'm articulating in words that's available in that board packet. And what you'll see from this map called the parcel ownership in and around the community of Bolsa Knolls is that there are easily dozens of properties that the Santa Rita Creek flows through. Many of those properties are privately owned properties. And of those, there's one parcel that the Monterey County Water Resources Agency owns, and there's only 3 little parcels that are owned by the County of Monterey. The rest of the parcels through the community of Bolsa Knolls and then upstream in the community of Bolsa Knolls are all private properties, which means that the private property owners are the ones who own that portion of land that the creek goes through and have that responsibility. So that's one of the major challenges, is that there's not one single entity that's responsible for that creek maintenance. It involves multiple parties, which include private property owners. The other complication that is spoken to in much better detail in the report is the permits. It begs the question, why are these permits required and what's involved with these permits? Well, whenever there is work done in an area known as habitat or environmentally sensitive habitat areas, there exist endangered species. When the Endangered Species Act at both the federal level and the state level were passed, various species, both plant life and wildlife, were recognized as being protected. And as time, that list has grown. So as time has gone on, that list has grown. And one of those sensitive species, endangered species, in and around Santa Rita Creek is the California tiger salamander. And there's also areas where the red-legged frog have also been noted to be in the area. Because those are protected species, that immediately sets off a requirement for regulatory agency permits. One of the more complicated ones is the permit that's issued by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. There would technically be 2 permits needed from them. One of those is a lake and streambed alteration agreement, which is a relatively straightforward one that county staff have familiarity with in doing bridge projects and culvert projects. The other complication, because it's an endangered species, is the second permit called the incidental take permit. And that's a very expensive permit. It requires multiple mitigations, which includes having the possibility of needing to find land and establish new habitat for these displaced California tiger salamander in some other area. But again, those are all things that would be prescribed when those permits are applied for, if that is a direction ultimately selected, and what would be involved in that point in time for that permit. So work around creeks or habitat are generally very complicated, for one, because of ownership of land, and then secondly, because of the types of permits that may be needed, depending on the kind of species that might live in that area.
And I really appreciate that additional information on this. If you have a minute to go through the Measure AA next, that would be our next phase.
Certainly. One of the things passed in the November 2024 election cycle was the Measure AA sales tax measure. And that was a general sales tax that the Monterey County voters were asked if they would consider. and it was for services in unincorporated Monterey County. Again, unincorporated Monterey County specifically, not in the cities, unincorporated Monterey County. The measure passed, and since that point in time, general sales tax dollars have been collected. And at a past board meeting earlier this calendar year, the board approved commissioning early success projects by both Public Works and Parks, as well as some other entities, to show the ratepayers what their dollars are paying for. With that comes a need for project funding signage so that people know where their sales tax dollars are being spent. Staff is going to share screen, so please pardon the brief pause as we do so. And thus one of the decisions the board made was what type of sign and what should the sign say? They considered multiple options, and the one shown on the screen is the one that the board had general consensus on and voted to adopt. And so the sign that you see before you with its wording is a large purple background sign that says, "Thank you for investing in our collective future." The funding source is Measure AA, and it demonstrates that this is where your tax dollars are at work. This sign is one that the public can expect to see where there is a non-road project that is being done. When there's a road project that's being done, the public can look forward to seeing this other sign's wording. So the same exact sign is the one that'll be used on a road project, but the wording will be slightly different. On a road project, instead of the words that say wording to the effect about your investment, instead the sign will say better roads and a brighter future for County of Monterey. So we ask our public to please be on the lookout for these purple background signs because they denote where the Measure AA dollars will be spent. And thus, our board made the decision to dedicate these Measure AA dollars for early success projects to show immediate delivery back to our public. And one of those locations is down in the South County, in and around an unincorporated community known as Bradley. And we have some examples showing not only work that was being done in that community, we are already done with the work in that community. So we're going to show a very, very brief overview of some of that work in the unincorporated community of Bradley done by and completed by these Measure AA dollars. And so this was one that was started shortly thereafter the board meeting earlier this calendar year in February. And these are just some examples of the before and after pictures for the community. And this shows the road called Bradley Road. And the next one shows Plato Street, which is by the post office in that community, again, before and after. This is another example of before and after on Monterey Street, which is by the fire station. And this shows Salina Street, which is one of the streets in that community. And Meadow Road, which is also one of the streets in that community. So not only has the county board directed these dollars to be used, the Public Works Department is already delivering on that for our ratepayers. So that's just one example of the many different projects which the board has commissioned using these new sales tax dollars. Community of Bradley is already done for the limits of which were shown to the board. And staff have already done a road known as Blackie Road in the community of Castroville. Staff have already started a road in the North County called Dolan Road, and that's one that we anticipate being completed in the next couple of weeks. And then a road that is now completed is a road known as Reservation Road nearby the community of East Garrison. So work is already being delivered to the ratepayers, and these various list of projects for roads that were brought to the board in February of this year will be completed before the end of this fiscal year, which is 30 June 26. So great successes, lots of things the public can anticipate to see. So please be on the lookout for the purple signs to see where Measure AA dollars are being spent.
And thank you for sharing some of the road work that's already been done and it's underway. And I'm sure people are going to love to see those signs. Randy, thank you so much for walking us through a lot of information. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for having us.
Well, our weather may be cooling down a bit, but fire danger is just around the corner and it might even be already here. We're going to get a look at our current fire danger, plus some tips on fire safety. We're very pleased that Josh Silveira, who's a battalion chief with CalFire, and Mike Dippel, he is the Monterey District Ranger of California State Parks, are still with us on the briefing to share this important information about fire safety. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. And Josh, I didn't know if you wanted to start, or Mike, whoever would like to start, because I know, Josh, you know about the overall fire safety area. And Mike, I think talking to people about how to be safe in the parks this summer is going to be very important. Who would like to start?
I guess. Go ahead. Yeah. So across the entire region, we're seeing fuel moisture start to dry out with that change in weather that we saw a couple weeks ago. Things are warmer and drier. We added some wind into it through the Salinas Valley, and that really started to dry out our fuels. As you can see, driving up the 101 corridor, our grass crop is already starting to turn brown. It's very thick and tall. We had multiple growth cycles through the year. And we're starting to experience small fires scattered throughout both San Benito and Monterey counties. After those fine dead fuels, the grass fuels start to dry out, and the brush model, our kind of medium fuels, transition and start to dry out. We're really going to see that fire danger increase throughout the area. Locally, we're in our second rehire academy with our seasonal firefighters. We currently have 6 state engines available for response daily. After Friday, I believe that'll take us to an additional 2 engines plus our helicopter crew. So we'd be at 8 engines plus the copter out of Hollister with its flight crew. Through the wintertime, we were able to successfully complete a series of vegetation management projects, which included fire breaks, which were showcased a couple weeks ago in the Jacks Peak area. We have the West Side Fuel Break down in South Monterey County, just outside of Bradley, where we worked with BLM to create a pretty substantial fuel break out there to help control some of these fires, give us some strategic holding points throughout the county where we can really draw a line and make a stand and stop these larger fires before they spread. Again, locally, I think our largest fire to date was about 2 acres, and it was in grasses in the South Monterey County. And that was the result of a control burn that had spotted outside of its containment lines.
Josh, thanks very much for that overview, because I think people are getting complacent. We had some hot weather before and it was great and we felt like it was summer, and then it's cool again. So people think that they are, safe at this point from fire danger, but they're really not. And Mike, let's turn to you. When people come to the parks, they're going to bring things with them. They may have a car where they're dragging a trailer. They may want to do a campfire. They may have matches with them. What are we telling people at the parks about fire danger?
Yes, so we're having our park attendants at the entrance, particularly for us. Big Sur is our biggest concern with all this, with Pfeiffer and Lime Kiln State Park and Julia Pfeiffer and those parks down there. Our park attendants are out on foot patrols, which has proven to be really effective as people come into the park, giving them these rules, telling them to use fire rings, make sure you have water and a shovel nearby to put fires out the right way. Don't have fires outside of fire rings. Try not to park on dry grass and keep your vehicle running or generator running. Having clear debris, keeping your tents and gear safe distance from the flames. We've had fires start that way too, and making sure they're checking the weather. You know, a lot of times people come from a location where it may be foggy or cold along the coast, north or south of here, and they get to the Big Sur Valley and the temperature goes up 25, 30 degrees. And Big Sur really is one of the places, as we've learned in the past, can have a catastrophic wildfire start from something as simple as a cigarette, or a spark of a vehicle. So we're really just out educating right now in this kind of period where we're going from winter to summer, making sure the park visitors know this stuff and they're getting handed fire regulations as they come into most of our parks, and particularly late summer is always my biggest concern, going into fall with dry offshore Santa Ana wind conditions and warm temperatures. That's really the worst time of the year, August, September, late July. So we're out there making sure all of and we're seeing a lot of visitation. The highway opening has dramatically increased visitation along the coast, with people both passing through, and all of the campgrounds are sold out. The private campgrounds, the state campgrounds. We are going to be reopening Limekiln State Park too to camping, which is exciting. So yeah, lots of good stuff going on. But with that, we got to make sure everybody's safe, and we're trying to do the best we can to educate folks as they come into the area.
Mike, at some point, aren't campfires banned in some areas in some parks? Does that affect the parks within your purview? Because the very times that you were talking about, August, September, October, you hear a lot of concern about having a campfire anywhere in any park.
Yes, we do try to follow suit with the U.S. Forest Service on what they do, but we do have the authority and do sometimes ban fire due to like red flag conditions or certain anticipated weather patterns that are coming up with strong winds. And we have done that, and we'll continue to do that during those critical fire danger. We'll move to gas fires only sometimes, or just a straight ban. So no wood where the embers are blown off, but some sort of controlled gas stove. And then other times when it's really bad, just a straight no fires. But right now we're open. Fires are allowed right now.
And that's where that education is really important for people are excited to be there, but you want them to be there responsibly.
Absolutely.
And then, Josh, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you recommend for property owners in these rural areas. You talked about, the biggest fire wasn't that big, but it was a control burn that got out of hand. What are your recommendations for people with property, in the current conditions? And I don't know if you can turn your phone on or if you're at a spot where you can't turn your camera on.
Oh, I can turn my camera on. It's just not the most beautiful background in the world. I'm sorry about that.
It's all right. We always like to see you.
We really encourage folks to continue to work on their home hardening, defensible space around their houses. It's something that they should be working on year round. This time of year, as conditions dry out, but we do get a little bit of humidity recovery through the evening time. Those early morning hours up until lunchtime or so are the times to get out there and continue to work on fuels reduction around your house. Rather than taking a lawnmower out and potentially striking a rock or something hard with a metal lawnmower blade, creating a spark and potentially causing a fire. This time of year, as we transition into those fuel moistures drying out, we really look at alternative methods, whether that's using a weed eater, so the string trimmer that is much less likely to cause a spark, or really getting creative and using goats or some other grazing animal to really reduce that fuel load around their houses. As people are traveling more, starting to recreate, if they are towing trailers, we really recommend checking your trailer chains to ensure that they're not dragging, potentially covering them with some sort of nylon material so that in the event that they do strike the ground, they're not creating a spark. If people are still having wood warming fires or a fire in their backyard in the evening to roast marshmallows or whatnot. Make sure that they do have some sort of water source nearby, whether that is a hose, a bucket of water, a fire extinguisher, whatever that is, in the event that you do get a spark outside of your fire pit. We do really want to make sure that people are prepared and able to act rapidly rather than hunt for that water source. Really, like I started off with, though, home hardening and vegetation management should be something that's looked at year round, and not just as we transition into fire season, where those grasses and fine dead fuels are already starting to cure and really become part of a problem.
And Josh, it was great that you mentioned the assets that are now becoming ready in anticipation of fire season. You mentioned the 8 engines, the helicopter. What about staffing? Is staffing starting to grow as we near the most dangerous times?
Yeah, it's a moving target for us. We'll typically get into peak staffing somewhere in mid to late May. We're currently in a transitional staffing period. Typically through the winter, we only staff 3 engines, and then our helicopters available for water dropping only. But as we transition into fire transition time now, we're moving into 8 engines, and ultimately, when we hit peak staffing, we'll be at 17. All of our aircraft are starting to come on. All of our pilots for our fixed wing assets, the air attacks or our kind of eyes in the sky aircraft, they're out doing all their refresher training, and then our tanker pilots are coming on contract and doing all of their refresher training currently too. So we expect to go to peak staffing sometime in mid to late May with 17 engines, 3 dozers, 1 air attack, 2 tankers, and a helicopter with crew out of Hollister, again, sometime in mid to late May.
Josh, thanks so much for both the advice and the tips, as well as letting us know, where CalFire is at, and that it's good to know you're ready. We're always happy when you're ready. And Josh, thank you and Mike for providing this great information and safety tips. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having us.
Well, currently out. Thank you, Mike. So currently out for public review is the environmental justice element of our county general plan. What is that element, and what does it mean for communities in our area? We're going to take a closer look at this. We're very pleased to have Sarah Wikle. She's a principal planner with our Housing and Community Development, and Edgar Sanchez, associate planner, also with Housing and Community Development. And this is going to be a presentation that is going to be bilingual, and we'll let Sarah lead us off. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Maya. Thank you for the introduction. And I think Edgar is going to share screen, so we'll wait for that to get uploaded. All right, perfect. Thank you, Edgar. So as Maya said, I'm Sarah Wikle. I'm with our Housing and Community Development Department here with Edgar Sanchez, who's our project planner. And today we will be doing a brief overview of the environmental justice element, what its purpose is, how it interfaces with our general plan, community engagement to date, and then what we're looking for as part of the public review period from the community.
Hola a todos, buenas tardes y gracias por acompañarnos hoy. Mi nombre es Edgar Sánchez, soy un planificador del Condado de Monterrey y hoy estoy aquí para presentar el proyecto de elemento de justicia ambiental del Condado de Monterrey. Hoy daré un resumen de qué contiene el borrador del elemento de justicia ambiental y también mencionar que está disponible para una revisión pública y les explicaré un poco de qué contiene el elemento y cómo la comunidad puede participar.
Great. So what is the environmental justice element? And so the environmental justice element is a newer requirement for general plans that was adopted by the state of California, and specifically focuses on trying to address degraded environmental conditions that may lead to disparate impacts and adverse health outcomes in communities. And we're looking here at unincorporated Monterey County and specifically disadvantaged communities, which we'll discuss further. Some of these issues include pollution exposure, limited access to public services, housing and infrastructure inequities, climate-related health risks, and limited access to healthy food and recreation opportunities. The goal is to ultimately ensure that all communities have fair access to healthy environments and essential resources.
So, ¿qué es el elemento de la justicia ambiental? So, en esencia, este plan se centra en mejorar las condiciones ambientales y la salud pública en las comunidades que enfrentan a los mayores desafíos en la parte no incorporada al condado de Monterrey. Estos desafíos pueden incluir la exposición a contaminación del aire, del agua, acceso limitado a los servicios públicos, a las malas condiciones de vivienda y riesgos relacionados con el cambio climático. Y el objetivo del elemento es garantizar que todas las comunidades tengan acceso equitativo a entornos saludables y recursos esenciales.
And so again, why the county must prepare an environmental justice element. So I briefly mentioned the Senate bill or state law changes. This is actually through Senate Bill 1000. And this requires jurisdictions to adopt an environmental justice element when 2 or more general plan elements are updated concurrently. And as you probably have heard, the county has a few element updates underway, specifically the housing element and the safety element. So therefore, we are working on the environmental justice element creation as well. And disadvantaged communities are identified, which the county does have, as the state law defines disadvantaged communities. The general requirements of an environmental justice element are to, again, reduce the unique or compounded health risks in disadvantaged communities, enable better civic engagement, public decision-making processes, and ultimately prioritize improvements and programs for disadvantaged communities. The environmental justice element should include goals, policies, and actions that achieve all of these general requirements and goals.
So, ¿por qué el condado debe preparar un elemento de justicia ambiental? So, el elemento de justicia ambiental es un requisito del proyecto de la Ley 1000 del Senado de California. Esta ley exige que los gobiernos locales aborden los desafíos ambientales y la salud pública en las comunidades que enfrentan mayores cargas ambientales. Y parte de esta ley exige que el condado identifique dichas comunidades que se consideran desfavorecidas, y cuando se identifican esas comunidades exige que el condado desarrolle metas, políticas y acciones que reduzcan los riesgos para la salud de esas comunidades, mejoren el acceso a los servicios públicos y garanticen la participación de la comunidad en la toma de decisiones durante todo este proceso.
Apologies, hopefully you can still hear me. I was muted for whatever reason. So as we've discussed, the environmental justice element is going to become a component of the county's general plan. The general plan is the long-term blueprint that guides land use decisions and community development within the jurisdiction of unincorporated Monterey County. And this ultimately means that the environmental justice element will continue to inform future decisions related to housing, infrastructure investment, public services, and environmental health across the county. And so both the environmental justice element does stand on its own as a chapter in the general plan, but it also interfaces with all these other key components of the county's long-term planning documents for growth in the community.
So, este elemento de justicia ambiental se entregará al Plan General del Condado. El Plan General del Condado es un plan estratégico a largo plazo que orienta el uso del suelo o de la tierra y el desarrollo comunitario del condado. Esto significa que una vez que el elemento de justicia ambiental sea adoptado, será parte de las será considerado cuando las futuras decisiones relacionadas con la vivienda, la infraestructura y los servicios públicos y la salud ambiental de todo el condado.
And so as we discussed previously, again, the environmental justice element is really focused on disadvantaged communities, shortened to DACs, in Monterey County. As part of the draft environmental justice element that's out for public review, there was an existing conditions report and surveying that was done across the county to help inform the goals and policies in the public review draft. And this, again, the existing conditions report ultimately identified 11 disadvantaged communities within unincorporated Monterey County. These include places in the community such as Baranda, the community of Bradley, community of Castroville, community of Chular, Las Lomas, Lockwood, Moss Landing, Pajaro, Pine Canyon, San Ardo, San Lucas, and other unincorporated community areas. Most of them, as you can see on your screen, are concentrated in northern Monterey County with, and then further south into southern Monterey County along in the Salinas Valley specifically.
Durante el proceso, el condado identificó 11 comunidades desfavorecidas dentro del área no incorporada al condado de Monterrey. A estas comunidades fueron identificadas utilizando datos estatales que analizan los impactos ambientales y las condiciones socioeconómicas. Como podemos ver, la mayoría de las comunidades están concentradas en el sur y el norte del condado. Estas comunidades incluyen Boranda, Bradley, Castroville, Chular, Las Lomas, Lockwood, Moss Landing, Pájaro, Pine Canyon, San Ardo, San Lucas y otras partes no incorporadas del condado.
And so the environmental justice planning process has been going on for a number of years at this point. There was some initial, again, data collection and analysis and community and outreach and engagement that happened on the front end to inform preparation of the draft, and that will also continue to evolve and happen as we refine the draft element, go through some public review process, and the review and adoption process. The draft element was developed through a combination of, again, the data analysis and the community input in the existing conditions assessment that's attached as an appendix to the draft. And these ultimately helped staff understand some of the environmental challenges that are facing community members, and we'll go into some of the other community engagement that staff undertook to inform both the draft element as well as the existing conditions report. The reason we're all here is we do have the draft element out for public review. We were typically looking around the mid-March to mid-May, so about a 60-day review period. However, we want to make sure we're really getting out into the community and meaningfully engaging on this element as it's new, and so we might look to lengthen that public engagement period depending on how our outreach goes.
El proceso de planificar este elemento se elaboró mediante una combinación de análisis de datos y la participación comunitaria. Durante el proceso preparamos una evaluación de las condiciones existentes para comprender los desafíos ambientales que enfrentan las comunidades, y luego trabajamos con los miembros de la comunidad para identificar estas prioridades. Hoy el borrador de elemento está disponible. Es una de las razones que estamos aquí, para dar el aviso que está disponible, y tras el periodo de revisión pública y participación y divulgancia comunitaria adicional, este elemento se perfeccionará y será mandado a la Junta de Supervisores para su aprobación.
And so some of the community engagement, again, that we've done previously is there were some focus groups that were undertaken with county staff. There's also been development and creation of an environmental justice community advisory committee. County staff had multiple meetings with that group, which is comprised of representatives from our disadvantaged communities throughout the county and key stakeholders. There were also some pop-up events and community meetings to really get out into various parts of the county. Those were, again, tabling at various community events, having some library displays across unincorporated Monterey County, and meetings with neighborhood groups. And then one of the really helpful pieces of the outreach too was an online survey, which county received over 300 responses, which is great. And that was focused predominantly on various environmental justice topic areas, and then informed some of the goals and policies that you will see in the draft element.
La participación comunitaria ha sido fundamental durante todo este proceso. En los últimos 3 años hemos realizado reuniones comunitarias, eventos, en las comunidades, grupos focales. Y parte de eso fue que lanzamos una encuesta en línea y también colaboramos con el comité asesor que es entregado por miembros de la comunidad y miembros que viven en la comunidad. Durante este proceso, en total recibimos más de 300 respuestas a la encuesta que lanzamos en línea y cuáles contribuyeron a la elaboración de este plan.
And so some of the key kind of takeaways that staff heard through those community engagement processes and that informed some of the initial goals and policies and the framework for an implementation action plan were specifically concerns related to air pollution around freeways and access to safe and affordable drinking water, the need for affordable healthcare, reliable internet, utilities, childcare services, parks, community facilities, increased need and options for healthy food access, affordable produce, and an interest in development of community gardens, the need for safer neighborhoods, sidewalks, crosswalks, bicycle routes, and parks, concerns about housing affordability, insurance, heating and cooling systems, and unhealthy living conditions. And then in terms of climate-related concerns, a lot of focus on wildfire, drought, and water supply issues, extreme heat, flooding, and extreme weather events outside of what are the normal weather patterns are. And again, these priorities then directly informed the framework for approach to the environmental justice element.
De esta iniciativa sugirieron varias preocupaciones clave de forma recurrente. A los residentes expresaron su preocupación por la contaminación del aire, el agua que usan para tomar, el acceso a la atención médica y los servicios públicos, la asequibilidad y las condiciones de la vivienda, el acceso a los alimentos saludables, la seguridad de las calles y los parques en sus comunidades y los riesgos relacionados con el clima, como los incendios y calor extremo, inundaciones. Y estas prioridades sirvieron de base para el borrador del elemento de justicia ambiental que está disponible hoy.
And so given that, again, we've done that community outreach and engagement, we staff wanted to give just a high-level overview of how the document itself is structured. So the environmental justice element is separated in almost what I would call like chapters or topic areas. So kind of the first discussion set is related to civic engagement. So there's typically some background information and then goals and policies related to civic engagement as a topic. And that structure is followed throughout the rest of the chapter. So the second set of goals and policies or chapter is related to pollution exposure. Then we go into access to public facilities, access to healthy food, access to physical activity and recreation, safe and sanitary housing, and exposure to unique or compounded health risks. And then the end of the document is the appendices where then that existing conditions report lives, as well as summary of community engagement to date.
Según lo que hemos escuchado y lo que muestran los datos, el plan se centra en 7 áreas clave. La primera es participación cívica, la segunda es exposición a la contaminación de aire, la tercera es acceso a instalaciones públicas, la cuarta es acceso a alimentos saludables, y la quinta es la recreación y la movilidad, y luego las 6 y 7 es vivienda segura y saludable, y la última es riesgos climáticos. Y estos son las áreas que guían los objetivos y las políticas del plan. Adicionalmente, al final del documento, en los apéndices, tenemos las condiciones existentes y la participación comunitaria que hemos hecho.
And so another important thing to note is we did take this to the Planning Commission in March for a workshop, and we did get some initial feedback on how to help make this document, which a lot of our planning documents are very long, hundreds of pages, how can we really focus some of the public's review, and how can we put together some cover memos or guidance documents based by each kind of disadvantaged community, some of our survey results, what we heard, but we wanted to just kind of leave these questions here to help contextualize some of the feedback that would be helpful to staff as we continue to refine the plan. Specifically, staff is interested in wanting to make sure that the existing conditions report and or survey results in the back appendix of the EJ element, do those actually reflect your experience with these various topics as it relates to environmental justice and what you're seeing in the community, in your community specifically? Are there key issues that are impacting your community more than others? Again, staff knows unincorporated Monterey County, very diverse communities and very key issues that may rise to higher level of significance in certain disadvantaged communities than others. And so we're really interested in getting feedback as we do our outreach of what kind of community, key issues impact your community more than others. And then lastly, what types of solutions would be most beneficial in your community? We do have some survey results, and those, again, kind of formulated the framework for goals and policies, but as we look at the goals and policies and then really look at an actionable implementation plan, getting the key feedback on solutions that feel like they would be the most useful in our unincorporated disadvantaged communities would be really beneficial to staff, so that we, again, make sure we're looking at the full picture and can really work to make some of these implementation actions for staff and as part of our work plan beneficial to our communities.
So, como parte de este periodo de revisión pública, tenemos todo el documento disponible para su revisión. Hay unas áreas donde estamos solicitando la opinión, áreas claves donde queremos saber más sobre la comunidad. Queremos ver si las condiciones existentes o las respuestas a la encuesta reflejan su experiencia. Si hay problemas en su comunidad que los afectan más que las otras. Y finalmente, ¿qué tipo de soluciones serían más útiles? Sus aportes y opiniones ayudarán a dar forma a la revisión final del plan antes de que sea adoptado.
And then, so in terms of the timeline and next steps for the draft environmental justice element, so again, the public review period currently is through, started in early to mid-March and will go through early to mid-May, depending on how, during that time period, specifically in the April to May timeframe, staff will be going out into the community to do some more targeted outreach, specifically working with our various supervisorial offices, community groups, to really find the best ways to notify the community that this draft is available for public review and really clarify some of the feedback we originally heard by community area and get some really targeted feedback on the questions we previously posed. So that public review period may go a little bit past the May 11th timeframe to allow for us to really adequately engage with our community groups. We're also working with stakeholder groups with other county departments to help formulate and develop an action plan that, again, we're looking to bring back at a second community meeting in the summer and with a planning commission workshop. And so summer, we're working and taking all of that feedback that we've received on the draft, doing some revisions, and then again, publicly releasing some ideas related to an action implementation plan that will help drive policy work in the plan with the planning team as it relates to environmental justice. And then we are targeting in fall a planning commission hearing and a board of supervisors adoption hearing for the environmental justice element. We will also be targeting CEQA review for this and other element efforts in the summer-fall timeframe.
So, para los próximos pasos, el borrador está disponible para la revisión pública. Este elemento ha estado disponible desde el 11 de marzo y estará disponible hasta el 11 de mayo del 2026. Es posible que sea extendido debido a alcance comunitario adicional que el personal del condado quiere hacer. Durante este periodo continuaremos a hacer alcance a la comunidad, buscaremos eventos donde el personal del condado puede llegar a su comunidad y darle un informe o tener una conversación sobre sus opiniones. Más adelante, este año, el condado publicará el borrador actualizado con todos sus aportes y comentarios y cualquier informe adicional. Y después desarrollará un plan de acción y implementación y lo someterá a las audiencias públicas en el 2026.
And so that concludes our presentation. If you have questions or comments, you can email our general plan updates email. Please include environmental justice element in the subject line, just so it's easier for us to track. We have our webpage that we're continuing to keep updated, and that's where you can find the draft environmental justice element. And then again, Edgar is our main point of contact on our planning team. We really do encourage everybody to take the opportunity to review the draft. There's multiple ways to engage with staff. You can submit comments via email. You can mail in comments to us. We have that information on the county's webpage. And ultimately, the draft is available for review online at the link that's shown on the screen. So, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Con eso concluye la presentación. Los invitamos a todos a participar. Tenemos varias opciones. Puede revisar el borrador en línea. También lo tenemos en nuestra oficina si gusta verlo en persona. Si gusta enviar comentarios, tenemos nuestro email general donde puede enviar sus comentarios. También está mi información de contacto. Y si gusta informarse más sobre el plan, puede encontrar más información en nuestro sitio web del condado o nos puede enviar un email o llamar por teléfono. Muchas gracias.
Sarah and Edgar, thank you so much for walking us through this. A lot of people are very intimidated by the general plan elements. They look at these documents as very big, they may be a little fearful to, they start reading it and they get overwhelmed. But for people who haven't read it, this really includes real people in the general plan. Sometimes the documents are very dry and they're more about rules and regulations, but this element really looks at people's situation where they live. And is that one of the reasons why you're encouraging people to talk about what they're experiencing where they live?
Yes, that's a key piece of the equation. I think part of we're trying to better ensure we know these documents, as you noted, are very intimidating, and this is the first of its kind for unincorporated Monterey County. And so we're really looking at, on our side and working with Edgar, how we can have kind of tools available for the community. How do we look at specific issues by geographic areas of the county? Because currently the draft reads more holistically for our disadvantaged communities of various topic areas and kind of key goals and policies. And so part of the outreach is really trying to support community members in knowing where the information is, us working as a team to really explain and distill down how this justice element, this general plan, really in the long term, because it's a long-term planning document, but it will and can result in policy changes that will affect people's day-to-day lives. And so we're really trying to be mindful of meeting community members where they are as it relates to the outreach and getting the word out, in addition to ensuring that any implementation or action strategies are based as much as possible on kind of the experiences with some of these key environmental issues, that it's reflected in the work that we do.
And then just for people who want to submit comments, they can submit their comments in either English or Spanish, that there's bilingual reception of their information, and that when you receive those comments, how do you use them? People may wonder, okay, I'm sending you my information, I'm sending you my story, I'm sending you my situation. How does it play in at your end?
Edgar, I also know Edgar, I don't know if you have anything you want to add or start with on answering Maya's question too, because I realized that I took it a little bit, but you're kind of the key lead as well.
Yeah, no, I think once we hear specific comments, I think it's important to note that people who live in these communities are really the experts in their communities. So they are the ones who know what are the challenges they face. And it's really easy for county staff to kind of, from a map point of view, look at the community and say, like, these are some of the issues that they're facing. But I think with the comments that we hear, it daylights the ground truths, basically what we're seeing in the existing conditions, and then also if there's any additional things that weren't considered in the element. I think it's one of the ways that those comments can be effective in changing the element before we finalize it.
Thank you both for walking us through this. I know there's a lot here, and people who may have been tracking it may have recall the online survey, and they may recall the community engagements that you've done, and they may not realize how long it takes to get one of these elements, completed. But we're really near the finish line, and it's very exciting that this would be part of our general plan. And I really appreciate you guys telling us more about it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank everyone for joining us on the news briefing this week. Our next briefing is next week, and we'll see you then.